Somebody else actually suggested this too, which I thought was interesting. This was published by Lue Treasure, who's written several books about the KDC. And I think he was the first one to necessarily associate this grid pattern with the Lue. Interestingly, somebody else proposed something very similar. I got this from a letter from a gentleman that lived in Nixon, Missouri, and obviously Roy Roush got the same letter because he published it as well. But it's a little bit different take on the same theme. That this idea that there's a broader sort of geographical placement for things that is kind of regular, but that you also have to be able to orient the overlay to find. Otherwise, you're going to be just a little bit off. And if you're off on one, you're going to be off on all of them. He also put in that little black shade, which I thought looked a lot like the corner of the pyramid there. But that's just another version of the overlay. And they all kind of seem to be pointing to the same idea that it would actually not only be possible, but that it would be likely that a cache site would have multiple cache sites. What does that look like, guys? Looks like the medicine wheel. This is a very well-known treasure out of Texas called the Spider Rocks, which has also been proposed by many to be a KGC cache. These are two separate stones. There are actually three stones that were about 35 miles apart on a big triangle in Texas. But again, we see this idea of concentric circles. We see what looks kind of like either the medicine wheel or another version of the overlay. There is some suggestions, again, where things are intersecting. These aren't just circles. These are circles with the lines that suggest where the points are that they're meeting, where they're crossing is something significant. And again, we see this sort of weird spray of letters and colors and symbols. But it's just another example of, now I'm starting to understand, maybe this is what Carl's referring to when he says, hey, check out the medicine wheel. It's kind of interesting. Because we're seeing this again and again and again. So this is where it's going to get really interesting. This is the actual, probably the newest part of the material that I've added. The Templar cross, which again we see reappear in various forms. Is anybody familiar with, his last name is Cerna. Terry Carter posted a video from
Louis Cerna.
Louis Cerna, there you go. Louis Cerna, oddly enough, is in Cimarron, New Mexico. He actually, if I recall right, he found the first one of these stones in a hotel. It was in a hotel lobby that they had on display, which is really interesting because our good buddy Tom Hilton, that didn't like Carl or Lou, lived in that hotel for 5 or 6 years before taking his own life.
So an elk hunter found it out in the mountains and brought it into Cimarron.
Correct.
And he asked him if he could take it. And they said, well, no. He said, just take it.
It had been there for quite a while. And then, of course, Louis Cerna goes out and finds more of these. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because again, I didn't know about these when I did the first presentation. So he brings in, I don't know, he's got about 4 of these. They look like they're old white slabs. They look like pylons, like a pyramid on top and a long shaft. We call it an obelisk if we were talking Egyptians. So these are the ones he finds. So right away, and again, Cimarron is a spit away from Black Lake, from Elizabethtown, from known new cache sites. We see the cross again. We see the sun. There's one up there, I'm going to give you a better picture, where it's got 2 sets of line that cross that look a lot like the crossbars in the map.
That's the same rock, right? That's the one in the St.
Oh, they've just turned it around?
Okay. It's the 4 sides.
So here's a close-up of that. To me, this looks a lot like, again, pillar going down, the arrow going across with an eye in the middle. And I thought that was really interesting. And again, it takes a little bit of imagination, but it could very well be symbolic of that. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And again, as far as I know, Carl did not know these, but for them to appear in the same area, I mean, literally within 20 miles, and for the symbolism to repeat itself is pretty telling. This is another one. Again, we get a good view of, there's another sun.
That's the other side.
And
There's
then,
4 sides to it.
okay, and then you've got the the lines coming out of the bottom there. But what's really interesting is that cross. I'm gonna show you guys something really fascinating. You can play around with the Lue map and get all kind of weird configurations. In this configuration, I have taken two versions of the same map. I have turned one over and I put them together. You guys ready for this? We get the cross. And we've seen this symbolism above too. That is the square and compass.
You might point out, Randy, that Jesse James was known to have spent many, many days, months in Cimarron Hotel. Very, very, 50 miles of a horse ride from Black Lake. He shot the roof. He lived there under an alias. Stockton.
I did not know that. That is pretty interesting. Carl talked a lot about that part of the country because there was a lot of history. There was Spanish. There was the French. A lot of these things also, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but if you're looking for a way to research this in a different way, a lot of these sites fall in what's called the Maxwell Land Grant as well. But interestingly enough, he talked a lot about the Raton Pass too, because there were a lot of treasure stories associated with that pass. A gentleman that used to run basically a toll booth to run through the mountain there, and treasures that he had allegedly hidden. And there was a great number of outlaws that operated in the southern band there too. I wasn't familiar with Jesse James, but I do know several bands that worked there. So this is part of the allure of the Lue is if you play around with it, you get all kind of weird configurations. You can also, I thought it was interesting that this kind of looks like a person. You got hair coming out like Pippi Longstocking here, looking at their eyes. If I went back to the very first slide, my wife's first thing she said was, "That's an elephant." You got the curve of the nose of the elephant, you got a tusk, and you got a big eye there. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's weird. But I thought that was really interesting that cross shows up, and it's such a prominent part of the certain stones. So it kind of, what am I at? Oh gosh, I got way too much. So this is kind of where I leave off. I'll open it up for questions. These are things that still kind of trouble me, or things that I would like to get better or more clear answers about. Again, that IAM code. Carl actually mentioned, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Lost Dutchman lore. He co-published a book with S.A. Connoisseur, who also co-wrote the Journals of El Dorado with him. And in his kind of tribute to her, he mentioned that she broke this IAM and YAM code. And we still don't really know what that is. He only mentions it the one time. And the way he kind of mentions it, it sort of suggests that he feels like there's people that are already initiated to that information and would know what it was. There's this idea again, are there still Lue caches that remain? Are there still ones that haven't been fully recovered? Are there still ones that maybe have been partially recovered, but there's still stuff there? I'm not sure how it would go now. In the 70s, Carl talked a lot about how hard those sites were to work because the ground was so mineralized that often metal detectors were completely useless in trying to locate anything more than a couple of inches below the ground.
Sir, did anyone try the satellite imaging where they can see if there's metal underground?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, that would be interesting.
But these would be small caches scattered over. I don't know how.
So somehow they can see what's directly under close to the surface and see if there's metal under there. It's a new way to do things.
Okay. Another reason, and I appreciate that, another reason I think that configuration is noteworthy is because one of Tom Hilton's claims was that the Lue was supposed to be 40 acres of gold. Now, I never saw Carl mention that. I don't know why anybody would think, like, where did the idea of 40 acres of gold come from? Again, I think if we're talking about an overlay, are we talking potentially about a 40-acre area, more or less? Carl did mention that the pots that were recovered were almost always recovered under less than a foot of ground. They were not very real deep. But again, if they're scattered over a pretty wide area, I could see where Tom might have gotten a bit of information that's kind of a challenge too. Again, we still don't really know where the Lue came from, so all of this is really speculative. I think some of it's better than others. I think that the Nazi thing is a dead end. I think all these other things are also real possibilities. Von Mueller was pretty tight-lipped. The only information I found out about his Black Lake recovery came from letters he wrote to other treasure hunters, which for me was actually interesting because people that said he had lied or hoaxed his readers, it's hard for me. It's one thing to write something in a newspaper knowing that you don't know the people you're lying to. It's another thing to write people that are your contemporaries, that are your peers, that are out in the field with you. And he's telling them, this story is true. I've been out there. We've been here. We've done this. He kept that story alive.
Is there evidence that he himself was a Mason?
There was, actually. The question was he a Mason? Absolutely. I have his obituary, and they spell it out very clearly that he was a Mason. That was actually listed in his obituary. But again, I've got multiple letters that he's written. He wrote to Michael Paul Henson. He wrote to Boyd Jolly. He wrote to a very well-known treasure hunter named Milton Rhodes. He wrote to another gentleman that published a newspaper named Johnny Pounds. He published one for 20 or 30 years called The Treasure Hunter. And in every single instance, he's talking about the Lue as a real thing. And these are people that he did business with. These are people that he knew personally. It's hard for me to imagine. It's bad enough that you would create a lie, but he's still talking about that lie 25 years later. And I'm thinking, if I told that kind of a whopper, the last thing I want to do is remind people 25 years later that I told that whopper. Because the longer I keep that story afloat, the more likely that somebody's going to catch me. So I genuinely think he believed it. I genuinely think he made a recovery. Again, how isn't that coded? How can it be read? Carl kind of indicated that it could be read mathematically, that there were different ways, algebraically or geometrically or even with calculus to calculate math. Some of that would, again, go back to suggesting that there may be an astronomical astrolot using the stars. And again, does any material evidence remain, or has it been documented? That's just a really nice way of saying, is any of that gold still out there? Does anybody have it? Or what did they do with it if they did have it? Again, if you read Carl's stuff, Carl did not write about a lot of big treasures. In fact, he discouraged treasure hunters from looking for big treasures. Lost Dutchman, Lost Adams, the Veiled Treasure, whatever. He was very adamant. Those treasures have been looked for by everybody. And there's 100 small treasures in your backyard because people are constantly hiding stuff. Focus on what's close to you. It's easier to research. You're not fighting against other people. It's easier to make relationships and do your research within 20 miles of your own house than it is to drive from Kansas to Flagstaff to go and get to the Lost Dutchman, right? So, is there any evidence? Has it remained? Is it documented? And that's a big question. I don't have an answer to that. I have a lot of theories. I have some that I think are better than others. I don't have a hard commitment. And if anybody is interested in the book or you look at the book, I swear I didn't set this up like it's an Amway presentation. This book that I put together is every bit of published information that I have found in 50 years. There's none of the speculation about symbols or Masons or Templars is in the book. This is literally my gift to people. I've done the work so you don't have to. Read it, make your own conclusions. Because I'm never going to go out there and look for it. I wouldn't know gold if I had nuggets sitting on my shoe. But I know how to look. I know how to read. I know how to dig. I know how to run down resources. I know people that have these kind of things, and I can say, hey, do you have any extras? Can you sell them to me? Can I pick them up from you? I have my own, again, pretty significant library. I've got some pretty cool stuff. Cool to me. A real pain in the butt to my wife. So yeah, I think that's really important. If you look at the book is really, this is everything. It's just basically a big clip book, but it's over 200 pages. It's profoundly indexed, and it's all there for you, so you don't have to go and look. And my hope is that somebody that's here or somebody that comes across it will say, "Hey, you missed this article in this newspaper," and I'll be like, it's pretty easy to overlook something when you're doing 6,000 pieces of material. I appreciate that. I have my email on there. I also have my business cards if you're interested. I love to talk to people. I love to bounce ideas around. I'm pretty open. That the best part about not wanting to find this is that I don't have to have any skin in the game when it comes to theories about it. I don't have to tell you, yeah, I think she's wrong, unless you believe it's not these.
So what is the last recorded time of anyone having any fine obviously with anything?
That is tough because he's talking about where they've been recovered, but he's not talking about when or when those things took place. 84 was when Michael Paul Henson and Lloyd Jolly had published their articles, and they referenced stuff that Carl had sent them to suggest. There were recoveries at Moore and Black Lake and Elizabeth County. When those took place, I don't know. He didn't share that information. He talked a lot about, he didn't use people's names. Again, Carl was big about, he was famous for saying hush or mush, right? Like, don't talk about this stuff. That's how you get jammed up. That's how the government gets involved. That's how, Billy Joe's second cousin, twice removed, shows up on your doorstep and says, that was actually my mom, So his big thing was he would talk about things, but he didn't use names. But he would talk about, this one guy I know found a Lue cache, and he went and bought an auto dealership in California, and that's what he's doing for a living now, right? And that's pretty consistent with Carl too, because Carl will tell you his treasure hunting stuff was subsidiary to what he was doing otherwise. He wanted a lot of his material in the National Prospectors Gazette was really about being self-sufficient, living off the grid, being your own boss. And part of that was how do you make money while you're doing things like prospecting, or when you're a small mine operator, you still got to make money. He was really big into something he called owl duty, which is essentially living on the road in a camper. Not having a house, not having a physical address. Well, how do you do that? You still got to pay for gas, you still got to pay for meals. So a lot of his writings are about how do I make money? How do I preserve money? How do I save money by recycling or repurposing things? And again, really, how do I carve out a niche for my own life? And for him, that's kind of what this really kind of represented, this idea that there is something pretty big out here. And people can get a piece of it if they know how to do it. I'm just not going to walk you through it.
Didn't he find when he found his Lue's apart, he didn't even take all of it. He just took one of his loaders and left.
Correct.
Yeah.
Everything I've read about him, that is exactly what he did. Yeah. He literally told people, there's still plenty back there if you want to go look for it.
Yeah, I got all I need.
Right. And he, again, as far as I know, he did not have a job from about 71 to 91 when he passed away. He ran the Examino, the shop. He ran the distributor for the metal detectors and the newspaper. I don't think even then publishing the newspaper was probably all that. It wasn't a moneymaker. He probably just barely broke even. He certainly wasn't living off of it. And again, that's speculation on my part. I didn't know him. He died when I was still in high school. But just kind of, again, you read enough about somebody, and I don't want to sound like an apologist or an acolyte, but you kind of read between the lines and you realize, this guy, he found a way to do exactly what he was talking about. And he didn't have to have $1 million home to do it. All he wanted to do was be able to have his weekends and weekdays free and not punch a time clock. And I think he absolutely did make that recovery. And I think it sounds weird when you tell people he left a lot behind. We only had one truck. He either didn't come back, or by the time he got around to coming back, somebody else had figured it out. And that was kind of the question with Hilton. Did Hilton find the right spot, or did Hilton find a treasure that had been recovered? Hilton really felt like he had been lied to and misled. And it was really interesting because he's talking about what a lie it was, but he made like 15 different trips to that site. He tried really hard to believe it was true if he didn't think it was true.
Maybe he didn't want people to know it was true. Maybe he didn't leave him alone.
That's a distinct possibility too. I don't know much about him. I know. Again, it was an interesting article. It was very long. It was unusually long for a treasure. Lue Treasure articles are usually 3 or 4 pages tops. This was probably fully all of 9 or 10 pages.
He's from Cimarron?
He was living in Cimarron. I'm not sure where he was originally from. He published a number of treasure articles. It's really interesting because in that article, he never once attributes the Lue map to Carl. In fact, he talks about Carl without talking about Carl. He never uses the name. I'm assuming there's probably a legal piece of that. He didn't want to get hit with a lawsuit. But it was still pretty interesting. He doesn't attribute any of this stuff. And later he writes another story about the Bell treasure, and his belief that that treasure was dug by Thomas Jefferson Beale and his men by finding that mine on the 112.5-degree parallel. So he uses that same clue and attributes it to the Thomas Jefferson Beale mine, the gold that they would recover and take back to Virginia, which I thought was interesting. He went out of his way to say that this whole story is a lie, and he cribbed this one pretty significant piece of obscure information out of the story and attributes it elsewhere. Any other questions?
I'm sorry I missed this, but where was this happening?
It originally came from a gentleman in Phoenix, Arizona, who lent it to Carl von Mueller and his partner, who copied it and then gave him back. He gave it to them with the express intention of them copying it and giving it back.
Where do you think the original is?
Well, it was in Phoenix. No telling what it is now. Again, it doesn't look like a map. Unless he's telling. First off, he had to literally tell Carl, or I'm assuming Hammond probably brokered that deal, but he had to literally say, "I have a map." He had to have some information about that either wasn't published or he didn't want to share. But they were aware that it was a map, and they have sort of presented it. So now we have that, and the original could have been thrown away. I've had some strange suggestions. Some of those were published too. There was one that somebody swore up and down that was a fabric pattern, and I thought, who would put that on anything, right? Another one that I've seen several times was somebody said that's a test or a drafting project, right? And then it appeared on the cover of a drafting book for college students. And I'm like, if you have one, I'd love to see it. that would certainly go a long way, one way or the other, towards solving it. And I think that's the other important thing. Me personally, if I don't have an investment in this treasure, like I want to make a recovery, it's much easier to take that stance and say, if you've got something that proves it wrong, I'll be happy to hear it, because I don't have to insulate myself from information that might be contrary. It's much easier to keep yourself open when all you're really concerned about is finding information and not controlling it. Did you have something?
Yeah, you mentioned Bill Hard Rock Canyon in aerospace in California. Was it in LA?
It was in Bellflower, which I think was pretty close.
Is that what Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard who were going to be up in LA? Or did you ever see them?
I don't believe so. I never heard those names come up. They started a treasure hunting and prospecting and oil speculation group. There was a lot of them in there for whatever reason. I'm trying to remember who a couple of the other names
Is that
were.
before you blew it up? Is that what got the blue house?
No, L. Ron Hubbard started psychology and started Jack Parsons and the aerospace.
One of them, yeah.
Was L. Ron Hubbard involved in aerospace?
No, but his best friend was, and he used their ideas to start.
Yeah, Carl Hammond actually was a pilot. He learned to fly in Wisconsin, I believe. He was part of the original Air Force that we put together when it was still part of the Army. Carl, on the other hand, wrote technical manuals for the government.
That would just be in the summer frame.
I gotcha. As far as I know, there's plenty of those. There's no end to those, but that's kind of the limit of what I've kind of squeezed out of that. I hope. Anybody else have any other questions? I appreciate your interest. I really appreciate the questions. What do you have, Gail?
Oh, here's an interesting thing about that obelisk in the ground.
Yeah.
I put a compass right alongside of it, and I shot a bearing from it. And it comes within a half a mile of a still working gold mine in Colorado. If that's any.
It's definitely gold country. Elizabethtown, which we talked about a recovery. Elizabethtown was very much mining town. I don't recall if it was gold or silver, but it had a boom and it had a bust, and I suspect more of it too. So there's definitely, I mean, from a sort of a geological, there's definitely evidence that there's a lot of mineral in that area, and that's being found somewhere that you would expect to find it at least. All right, I appreciate everybody's time. Again, I have I have these books here, and I got more out, and I'm also selling my National Prospector Gazette books. If anybody's curious about those, I can answer questions.